We're off and away. So welcome to everyone, including our online colleagues. And if you're listening to this, watching this online, we've just introduced ourselves in here, and Dan Fleming has suggested that it'd be a good idea if everybody got online and introduced themselves, because in a sense we're one big happy family, I hope. Okay. Again, for the benefit of our online colleagues, this is Terry Lovett talking. Mike Foley and Dan Fleming are here in the room as well, and we are the team that will be running both face-to-face and online, 10:40. And if you happen to be listening as a 60-40 people, or have got some in the room, also more or less the team that looks after the postgraduate equivalent of this course. Okay. Ooh, not going to get much out of that. Where did I put it? So they're the 12 weeks. I won't go through them. You can see all of this online. I just want to reiterate the point that we're starting in the broadest possible way, looking for this human phenomenon that's all about the spiritual, which clearly, I guess, before we get down to harder definitions, is what theology deals with. It is a discipline that's looking always to the spiritual side of life and somehow trying to get its head around what that is. We're going to look at it from its most ancient times in what we call primal peoples. We want to do some quick case studying around those amazing theological civilizations that developed about 5,000 years ago in the Indus Valley, in what we now know as India. The oldest of the major religions that we know, Hinduism, that developed in its very early form around that time. A most theological religion. You know, some people, you grow up in narrow little religious communities, and people can often sort of think, oh, we're the only ones who do theology. You know, Christians are the only ones who do theology because, we're the only ones who really believe in God or whatever. Hinduism is the absolute stereotype breaker in that regard. It's probably the most theological of all of the traditions. 330 million gods at last count. It doesn't get much more theological than that. A number of you have mentioned that you've studied religion at school and perhaps done religion here at the university. You'll have learned a lot from those sorts of courses. Sometimes those courses don't go very far into the theological dimensions of religions. You'll learn a lot about the structures and the rituals and the stories, the myths, etc., etc. But what we're going to be concentrating on this course is the theologies, how those different religions have put their heads around this remarkable experience that most humans, if not all, seem to have, most acknowledge, that there is this sense of something beyond and above just what you can see and touch and control in a tactile sort of a way. And then we'll do the same with Asian theologies, looking at the remarkable theologies that developed in and around what we now know as China and Japan and the other Asian countries. We come down to a fairly lengthy Christian case study. There's no doubt that we use Christianity as the major case study in this course. There's no getting away from the fact that it is the tradition that has had the most obvious influence on just about everything that we've become in Western civilization. But we do want to make the point, as we move into that Christian case study, that Christianity itself is an outgrowth of everything that's gone before it, in a sense, and in particular, obviously, of Judaism. And that one can't really understand what Christianity has been, particularly in the last 1,000 years, without understanding its interface with Islam. How Islam has influenced Christianity and the West over particularly the last 1,000 years in ways that are too little understood. And then we more or less do a bit of a survey through time of the ways in which Christian theologies have developed and competed. So you can learn lots about, what's happened in Western history. You learn lots about Christianity in its various forms. But all the time, what we're really wanting to concentrate on is theology and how it develops and how it competes, and the influences the enormous influences that it has on the cultures in which it is evolving and developing. We're very keen also that you see theology as a discipline among disciplines. In Australia we've had this funny tradition of pushing theology out of the academy. When the first Australian university was founded in 1857, that being Sydney, they actually wrote into the constitution of that university that there would never be a faculty of theology, that theology would never function as a discipline. And it was an odd move because in everything else they copied the British universities. They copied the Oxford and Cambridge kind of tradition. But in fact, at Oxford, theology's been there for 800 years, and it's still an absolutely vital part of that university. If you go to Oxford, theology is just all around you. Lunchtime seminars, and you can hardly do a program at Oxford where you probably won't do a bit of theology because there's so many theologians around there. But somehow there in the 19th century, in the middle of the 19th century, in that very, very sort of secularist era, there was some thinking that perhaps by keeping theology out, they were actually going to keep the church out. I think that was what they were really concerned about. What we're trying to do here at Newcastle is bring theology back into the academy where it belongs, to be a discipline among disciplines. There's a great cry for that, as we'll see, from the scientific world, from the psychological world, from other disciplines, to say, there are issues here that we need theologians for. So as we search for knowledge in places like this, and we break knowledge up into different disciplines with specialisations, I guess it's good to sort of get some sense of just what it is that theology does. And perhaps the best way is to sort of compare and contrast it. We've got a scientist or two in the room. If someone said, look, you really need to go over and do some physics, what would you imagine you'd be doing? What's physics all about, in a word? Stretch your mind back to year 10.
Science.
Yep, science, yep. What particular?
Gravity, the physical.
Gravity, the physical side of the world, yeah. The laws of motion, all of those sorts of things. What about psychology? Somebody, look, you need to go and do some psychology. What are they saying to you? Human behaviour. Sorry?
How the mind works?
Yep, how the mind works. Sociology, what's that about? Societies, cultures, how people kind of hang together, etc. Okay. Theology. You're getting so good. Yep, certainly does, and probably a whole lot more. But why would you do this rather than one of those? What are you looking for? Transcendent? You're the ones who've all made the choice to be here. People's relationship with the transcendent. Origins of life. God. Oh, there's a novel thought. Yeah. Knowing yourself.
Just morality.
Morality. Yep. Okay. We'll pin that down a little bit further. In some ways, I would argue that theology is the oldest of the disciplines. I mean, it was the discipline along with law that was there at Oxford when it started 800 years ago. That's a pretty good confirmation that it's old. But, you can go back a whole lot further. You can go back to the ancient Greeks, Plato and Socrates and Aristotle. I mean, they didn't have physics, chemistry, you know, blah, 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 all the things that we've done to sort of divide knowledge up and specialise. They were just smart people. They sort of put it all together. They were scientists and mathematicians and philosophers and sociologists and theologians, all kind of wrapped up as one. But the thing that you can detect when you go back and look at anything that, you know, Plato or Aristotle or any of those might have said, the notion of other, the notion of gods was always there. It was a sort of a sine qua non. You know, you couldn't not have it. There were a few ancient Greeks who tried to push the envelope a bit. Anaxagoras was one of them, to say, no, you know, don't believe in this God stuff. Well, even in this very democratic, old, free and easy, apparently, society, that was a bit much for people. So Anaxagoras got put away and killed. And Protagoras, he was a bit more careful. He came along a few years later and he said, well, I don't think I'm going to say there's no God. I'm not that silly. But I'd just like to put it out there that we don't know much about this God. You know, I can't say. I've never seen one. I haven't had a conversation with one. So I just want to put it on the table that I'm not so sure about this God. Well, he got run out of town too. It was all a bit much for them. So the absolute heart of all of their knowledge was, in fact, around the gods. And in that sense too, it really is in a way the oldest of the disciplines. It asks all of the old why and how questions that continue to be asked in modern day disciplines, in physics, in psychology and sociology. In a sense, I think fairly obviously, you know, particularly around the 19th century, it was kind of pushed out a bit by the sciences and the social sciences. If you've done any sociology, you've probably studied Emile Durkheim. Now he, unlike a lot of other characters in the 19th century, he actually had a fair amount of time for religion. He didn't say it was a load of bunkum that we needed to just get rid of. But he said it's probably had its day, one would have to say. And if religion's had its day, then, you know, it'd be fair enough to say that theology's probably had its day. Durkheim thought that religion had helped to sort of order societies, keep people together, keep the tribes organised. But now with the advance of understanding of the social sciences, psychology, we now know much better how people think. Sociology, we know so much better how people function as groups. We're not going to need religion, and therefore we're not going to need theology, and so theology kind of gets pushed out. But the interesting thing is that in some ways, I would suggest, in our own time, it's actually the sciences that are calling it back. You know, theology's kind of gone off into its own little world all over the place because it was pushed out of the universities, so every little church and flea-bitten organisation around the place set up its own little theology group. And it's now actually from the universities and from the researchers that we're hearing the call, where are the theologians to deal with some of these big issues that are actually coming up in science. I've probably made that a little bit too small, have I? Yeah. Okay, I'll read it. It's by, I think you could say, probably the top philosopher in the world today. A fellow called Giorgio Agamben, an Italian philosopher. He's spent most of his time known as a Marxist. If you know, you asked a philosopher, what's Agamben believe? They'd say, well, he's a Marxist. He's certainly not a religious kind of a character. But what he's saying here is modernity, having removed God from the world, not only has not exited theology, but it has only, in a certain sense, brought to completion the project of providential oversight. Now that's a bit wordy. What he's saying in a nutshell, you'll be able to see all this online afterwards. What he's saying in a nutshell is that there's no getting away from theology, that theology has impacted, influenced the way we've put our societies together in ways that we're only just starting to appreciate. And in a way, it's as religion in its traditional form, the churches and whatever, loses a lot of its hold and its control on life, that the rest of us are starting to see it. We've been a little bit blinded by church power, and it's stopped us, it's prevented us from seeing just how much religion and theological thinking has influenced everything that we've become, including, for him, the big one is economics. The way the Western world has constructed, the way the whole world has constructed its economic systems is, he says, at the end of the day, a deeply theological kind of a thing. So there's, like, if you're like a philosopher, a social scientist, an economist kind of saying, we need some really good theology to unpick things, particularly post-GFC, when our economic structures have let us down so badly, and everybody's rattling around trying to work out what happened, what do we do, how do we, what do we do about Greece, all the rest of it. He said, you know, the people we really need with their heads around this, the theologians, because they're the ones who can, if they're doing their discipline well, understand where all this came from, how we got ourselves into this mess. That's very big. I mean, that's not churchy kind of thinking. It's the opposition almost kind of howling to us, hey, you religious guys, you theologians, get your act together, because you've got a lot more to contribute to the world than you think you do. And we've got astrophysicists. I mean, Polkinghorne's just one name. I could name, you know, a dozen without even trying to think of it. These guys who are out there looking for other worlds, other planets, you know, who've found this planet-like, this Earth-like planet, you know, 13,000 light years away, whatever the heck it is. The further out these guys go, the more they are boggled, you know, mind blown by just how big it all is and how somehow or other it still holds together. And they're battling to theorise how that happens, you know, the string theory and this and that. The fine-tuning of the universe is leading a lot of erstwhile, more or less atheist scientists back to say, gee whiz, you know. When you get away from the idea of some long-bearded guy sitting up in a throne, you know, with angels running around sort of singing praise, and you just kind of come at it from the other side, my God, how does all this hold together? And Polkinghorne is one who also calls on the theologians. You theologians need to be doing a lot more than you're doing to help us in this. Quantum physicists Dana Zohar and her husband, now dead, Marshall, in Oxford, hard-nosed physicists who started about 20 years ago talking about quantum physics, and again, like Polkinghorne, sort of leading to the notion of, you know, this is just an amazing kind of a world. You come at it from the hardest physical perspective, you're still left with a sense of just how remarkable it all is. The laws of physics peter out at a certain point, and you're just left wondering how it all holds together. And she is one now, Dana Zohar, trained as a physicist, got a job as a research scientist, now spends most of her time around the UK and the US lecturing on the notion of supreme being and spiritual intelligence. So she's kind of gone the full circle. And I can tell you, I've sat and had coffee with her in Oxford. She is not a religious lady in any way, shape or form. She's still the hard-nosed physicist, but she is fascinated with the notion of supreme being and the spiritual intelligence that she sees in people. And of course, a lot of the psychologists have also led to this notion of spiritual intelligence. Robert Sternberg is what's called a psychometrician. It's kind of at the hardest, most statistically bound end of psychology. Psychometrics. Hard science, hard science. And that's what all of his early work was about. But the further he went into trying to measure psychological responses, the more he came up with this hole in the theory. This part of humans that none of the classic psychological theories can get to. And he also, like Zohar now, talks a lot about spiritual intelligence. He believes that there is in people an innate capacity to understand, to connect with the spiritual. And the neuroscientists, Dan mentioned neuroscientists, the neuroscientists in a way have taken that even further. The difference there is, I mean, these are the mind studiers, these are the brain studiers. The more neuroscience gets into actually peeling away the layers of the brain, again, the more people like Antonio Damasio will say, you know, there is something there. We can slice the brain up into all of its pieces. Say, yeah, that's the bit that does this, that's the bit that does that, that's the bit that does that. But there's something else there that holds it together, and we can't find that bit. And he's one together with a whole lot of other neuroscientists who also, I've heard him, you know, shouting from the lectern, where are the philosophers of mind? Where are the theologians who deal with issues of soul? All that wonderful tradition that seems to have been lost just at a time when we need it most. So those are two notions that are coming at us from very, very updated thinkers, all of them on the science side. Most of them, when you go through it, erstwhile atheist, agnostic, you know, in their youth, that's what they were when they were doing their science. That's because that was what you were. If you're a scientist, you know, you're an atheist. And kind of coming back, not coming back to religion, not coming, you know, not saying, oh, okay, I've got to go to church on Sunday then. You know, it's not the end of the journey at all. But leaving us with some big, big questions of the type that take us back to where it all started. When, you know, the caveman came out of his cave one morning and said, you know, there's something more to all this than meets the eye. What is it? The beginnings of the religious quest, the beginnings of theology. And it's being thrown back at us from what 10 years ago would have seemed like a most unlikely source. Okay, Dan. This is where Dan really comes into his own. There's a little clip, a little YouTube clip. Oh, yeah. If I can, what do we need to do? Should I mention this then? Physics, quantum physics, physical science side of things leading to this notion of supreme force, intelligent design, etc. I just want to now explore a little bit of what's coming out of these other fields, psychology and neuroscience and the likes, on spiritual intelligence. I mean, another, you know, when I first came here 30 years ago, if I had said to all of the psychologists rattling around the place with their IQ tests, I'm interested in spiritual intelligence, I'm quite certain I wouldn't be standing here now. I'd have been, you know, pensioned off, put in an asylum or something. And yet we've now got not only the notion, but some tests, SQ tests. I mean, I'm not certain I'm right into that, but it is interesting to see how far the psychological, neuroscientific fields have gone in trying to track down and measure this thing that they absolutely believe in. A fellow called Robert Emmons wrote a very important article about, 12 years ago, as you can see, and it was in the International Journal for Psychology, and it was a whole issue devoted to this notion of spiritual intelligence. Don't bother trying to write it. I won't leave it there long enough, but you'll be able to see it. But he came up with these 4 bullet points to try and grapple with what he, through his clinical experience, believed he was seeing. By this stage, we'd become quite comfortable not only with the idea of IQ, but the idea of EQ, emotional intelligence, social intelligence. Some had written about aesthetic intelligence, some had written about moral intelligence. Emmons and co. started to talk about this other kind of intelligence that they believe they were detecting in people that they could only best describe as spiritual intelligence. A fellow called Robert Noble defined it in this sort of way: a conscious recognition that physical reality is embedded within a larger multi-dimensional reality with which we interact consciously and unconsciously on a moment-to-moment basis. You can see some of the synergy there with the supreme being, intelligent design notion coming through from the astrophysicists. But these guys obviously are coming at it from another angle. They're not looking at the vastness of the world. They're studying people and what people report, people's troubles sometimes. What's the problem? Is it a cognitive problem? Is it an emotional problem? Is it a social problem? Is it an aesthetic problem? Some of them coming up with the notion that at the end of the day, the only thing that's going to get to the deep recesses of this issue is dealing with it as a spiritual thing. And I hasten to say these are people who are, would be the last ones who would want to get into spiritualism or seances or exorcisms, or they're just simply reporting in a very scientific way what they're seeing, what they're observing. Vaughan, that it's concerned with the inner life of mind and spirit and its relationship to being in the world. Interesting language for scientists to be using, I think. Now, this is a monster of a definition, but I just sort of don't even bother trying to write it or get your head around it. It just shows the lengths to which some are going to try and pin this thing that they sense as spiritual intelligence. And see some of the language, non-material, transcendent aspects of one's existence, leading to such outcomes as deep existential reflection, enhancement of meaning, recognition of a transcendent self. This is the one that keeps on coming up. Recognising other. And I guess that's the main point I'm trying to drive at, because I think that's where it all began, however many zillions of years ago, a recognition of other, more to life than meets the eye. There's something else there. And it's modern science that, in a sense, even better than theology, that's driving us back there. A fellow called Wigglesworth, he's the one who went all the way and came up with the test. And he copied Goldman's emotional quotient, emotional intelligence quadrants, and came up with 4 quadrants that he believed were measurable in people who are having these spiritual intelligence types of experiences. And the one, again, I just want to point to is the notion of some spiritual presence. Now, Mayer kind of rattled the field a bit a couple of years ago when he wrote an article that was really ripping into his colleagues for using the word intelligence. He said, well, they're just stretching the word intelligence too far. I mean, he's not sure you should even talk about emotional intelligence or social intelligence. Intelligence is intelligence. But certainly when it comes to spiritual, he didn't like it at all. He said consciousness would be a better word. Intelligence is too restricted. It connotes normal mental functions, where he would want to suggest that what he has detected as a clinical psychologist in his practice is something like an altered state of mind. Something that the mind is capable of, but not in its normal day-to-day cognitive functioning. And fascinatingly to me, he's the one who popped up with the word mysticism. And he's another one who, as a psychologist, a very hard-nosed psychologist, ripped into the theologians and said, hey, where are all you mystical theologians? You know, where's that wonderful notion of mysticism that we can read about thousands of years ago? Well, the church fathers and the Muslim Sufis, and who talks about mysticism these days? And yet we need it to be talked about because it actually does capture, it seems, this is a hard-nosed scientist talking, it captures a certain kind of human experience. And we psychologists don't really have the language, the notionality to deal with that. It's all rather reminiscent of Rudolf Otto, who probably, I think, as well as anybody, captured what that primal experience was of the cave person. In some of his experimental work, when he believed he detected this holy or sacred otherness, referred to it as a numinous, an other, a numinous experience, a frightening and tremendous, trembling kind of experience of other, and defined it as non-rational. In a way, he's agreeing with what Mayer was saying, non-rational, non-sensory experience of feeling. Or if it's sensory, it's like a sixth or seventh sense. It's not one of the five senses. But it seems to be as real to people having it. Non-sensory experience or feeling whose primary and immediate object is outside the self. That's the big point. That's what theology is interested in centrally. Otherness. Transcendence, if you like. So, we come back to what is theology? How do we define it? Well, if you do a trawl through dictionaries and Wikipedias and whatever, you find these sorts of things. It's a study of divine things. Well, that's a nice simple one. Sort of gets us on track at least. It's a study of something that's not natural. Study of religious truths, okay. Study of God and faith. System of opinions concerning spiritual matters. What they've all got in common is the notion of it being a study, of it being something rational, systematic thought. And that's what we find in the great definitions, if you like. St. Augustine defined theology as reasoning concerning the deity, reasoning concerning the other, reasoning concerning God. Thomas Aquinas, and it's interesting how the definitions reflect what was going on broadly in the time. Theology is a product of its times. It also influences at times. So Aquinas, of course, is faced with the advance of science and the great threat that science seemed to be originally to religion. So he was very keen to use the language of science in defining theology. But science wasn't this non-rational thing at all. Theology is not a non-rational thing. Theology is a rational thing, he was saying. It's a unified, very strict kind of a science in which all things are treated as an aspect of God, like Plato and Aristotle did. They looked at their world and they somehow or other made it fit with their understanding of who the gods were. At a different time, at the time of the Protestant Reformation, so Luther and co would have said the church had sort of lost connection, the whole God language was up there with the priests and monks and popes, it had nothing to do with ordinary people. He was keen to make the link with humanity. So what theology was for him was primarily studying the relationship between God and humanity. But again, the notion of a science or a study or a systematic set of opinions, etc. Richard Hooker, The Science of Things Divine. Nice and simple. Wilbert Kaufmann, in a way, defines theology by what it isn't. He says it's not religion. Not sure what theology is, but it's not religion, and goes on to make the point that religion too often is untheological. And that's the problem. You know, religion loses its rational self and just becomes a whole lot of, you know, incredible beliefs that no one can test or prove or put through any kind of a filter. And so people start believing that, you know, their God is telling them to go and blow things up and kill others, and no one can get at it because there's no rationality. Well, no, Kaufmann says whatever theology is, it has to be the rational side of religion. And so that's what I'd suggest theology is. It's the study that rationalises what is inherently often irrational, because it is about the other. It is about experience of other. And that's where our rational selves start to peter out. So we need a study that can deal with that, can rationalise the essentially irrational. So, bring it right down. What then is theology? That's an original, but you can have it. To me, it's the heartbeat of religion. So it's the thing that feeds religion. It feeds it with systematic study, with rationality, with tempered rationality, with feeling rationality. It's not just of the head. It's a rationality that takes in the whole person. That's why I like the work of those psychologists and neuroscientists. I think they've got us out of thinking that intelligence is all just a hard-nosed kind of cognitive thing. Intelligence is bringing our whole selves, our emotional selves, our social selves, our moral selves, our aesthetic selves to bear. And that's what feeds. It pumps life into religion. It makes religion real, theology. It makes it something we can know, we can control, we can make our own. Not something that controls us necessarily in some wildly irrational way. We can have religion, but not have theology. Then the whole the wonderful minds that we've been given are not being put to good use. We've got to put our heads to this thing as well as our whole being. I guess that's what I'm trying to connote by the notion of theology as the heartbeat of religion. The subject matter is clearly the spiritual. We've seen that. It's experiences of humanity about the spiritual. And it's about the ways that humanity has constructed and expressed those experiences. So it's about this other that the cave person felt, and that the modern scientists are, through their various disciplines, pointing us back towards. It's about the experiences of humanity about that, the ways in which people have experienced other, and then the ways that they go about constructing and expressing the systems they create, the religious traditions, the texts, the myths, the legends, the rituals. It brings in all of those things, but again, it does it in a way that puts our rational selves over all of that subject matter. That's the difference between religion and theology. So just fleshing that out a little bit. Theology is the study of other, or transcendence, or numinous, as Rudolf Otto would have it, as as objective force, as something real. Not meaning it's concrete, not meaning it's a physical other, but it's real. It's not just made up. It's not just a figment of people's imagination. That's what the astrophysicists are trying to say to us. You know, whatever this thing is that's holding this show together, it's real. It's probably the most real of anything that's real. If it wasn't real, the thing would just fall apart. So it's an objective force in that sense. Just fleshing this one out a little bit. It's the study of the nature and meaning of spiritual experience and the various beliefs that flow from it. The various ways in which people put this experience of other together across time through different traditions, the various ways in which, beliefs contest with each other, etc. That's all part of what theology does. And then right down to studying and interpreting the traditions, the oral traditions, particularly in the case of indigenous theologies, textual traditions, more modern sorts of theologies, the various structures, the various religious forms that people have created, which are all about, centrally, trying to capture, trying to ground and trying to convey from one generation to another through time these experiences. Some reaction. Time for you to talk. Time for you to tell me I've missed something. Why didn't you think of this? Yeah, that's good, but why did you bother saying that? I knew all that.
No, I think I did know all that. That was the thing that sort of made me ponder some things I hadn't really taken into consideration.
Yeah, so it's not a new rocket science, is it? It's all pretty much, when you think of it, fairly obvious, but probably not often stated. Least of all in and around, university education. Theology doesn't have a role, and I think that's the very interesting thing about the times in which we live, that you've got these other academics and researchers saying, we need you, theology. You've got a language, you've got a discipline, you've got a method, you've got a focus. It's older than any of what we're doing. But somehow or other, because we've kind of put churches and religious bodies in their boxes, which often are sort of trying to pop out in all sorts of odd ways, we've perhaps put theology too far away too. You look like you're just dying to say something. Yes.
I was thinking about what you say about string theory as well.
Yeah.
Folks read stuff like that. I'm sure why, because just out of interest, and I've often thought the same thing, like where does that come from, or where does that come from, or why is that here? And then when I get to string theory, it's kind of we're still sort of in a very grey area, what is this, holding this all together, like you're saying. Yeah, it's interesting to think about it. It's interesting to see that so many scientists are actually saying, theological perspective.
Yeah.
It's too much. Just looking at the way that atoms and things put together is remarkable. So I agree.
Thank you. Thank you. I've been endorsed. I mean, Polkinghorne is very interested in, he's one who says, we need theologians. Well, we don't need most of you, because you theologians are all just squabbling about, Catholics better than Anglican, or Muslims better than this, or, theologians have become sort of custodial police of their own traditions. We don't need that sort of theology. We need theology that is theology, that goes back and captures the essence of the human experience that it's all about. And maybe that, actually, if theologians did more of that, we mightn't have so many squabbles going on between, the petty-minded institutional justifiers.
So should we assume that that's the sort of theology you're going to teach us?
I hope so. If if we slip back to handing out the, how to join the whatever church, in week 3, then we'll have failed badly. Yeah, that's what we want it to be. That's what it's got to be. No, I mean, if you want another sort of, I want to believe more in this particular version of Christianity more than anything else, there are plenty of places to do that. That's not what happens here.
I started a psychology degree when it wasn't, and it may still not be in this institution, I don't know, but it was one of the reasons why I had to walk away from it, because I couldn't understand how you could teach it and completely disregard that stuff. It was taught with disregard that stuff.
Oh,
So
yeah.
It just didn't make sense without it.
It was quite hostile.
Yeah.
Quite hostile. Any talk of spirituality was, yeah.
I think people shy away from it because it's such an emotional and personal thing, and it can be a grounds for conflict. And I thought it was interesting. I read this week's notes on the, I don't know, I just got it off the site. I'm not sure what it's called, weekly notes or something. And it's talking about the different theologies, the past theology and the new theology, and it's talking about how interfaith theology assists the global village to function effectively. And like I had this conversation over here in the break, like technology is just moving so fast that it's hard for our morals to be keeping up to develop, what's correct and incorrect. Because all the new things we can do with technology.
Yeah.
Maybe that has something to do with the reason why. So religion was the basis for our morals, and now that we've gotten rid of religion, say, or put it in its boxes, no wonder that there is no guide for the morals that should be accepted within society. So is that something that a theologian would address?
Yeah, definitely. There's huge calls everywhere for, renewed sense of values. What's happened to what's happening in Australian politics at the moment. What's the problem? It's all around values, integrity, trust, So if the church clearly hasn't done its job, people wouldn't have thought it was relevant. But where do those things happen then?
Who thinks about those things?
Yeah.
Who addresses those issues?
Yeah. Well, where are the great overarching values that holds humanity together as a functioning village? Well, do the psychologists have to tell us that as well? One would think the theologians should be at least in the debate, but oddly often aren't. Because again, they're sort of off in their little churches and religious groups. And
Got an affinity or a perceived affinity with a particular religion.
yes, that's right. So, if you belong to us, well, you do this, you don't do that. But not dealing with the big questions of an overarching human set of rights and wrongs that can guide a global village that's, pretty much at each other's throat, one would have to say at the moment. And this is where Agamben too is really, really interesting, coming at it as a sort of an economics philosopher. Where are the theologians to sort of help us sort these things out?
But haven't ethicists kind of filled that gap? And Christian ethicists are just sort of a subset of ethics and philosophy?
To an extent.
In practice?
To an extent, but often again in a bit of a vacuum. You sort of take away the age-old theological roots, the thing that can be strung back thousands and thousands of years to when people sort of first realised how things can work better than in other ways if we do this. And in those days certainly would have put that in the context of some kind of belief in other. You know, the set of rights and wrongs sort of came from another world. They weren't just things that people would sort out for themselves. You sort of, you fracture that bloodline, then we're sort of rattling around trying to, again, you know, reinvent it for ourselves, I suppose. Okay, Dan has some things to talk with you about.
I was actually going to add something to that conversation, which was far more interesting than what I'm saying.
I thought you were going to say far more interesting than what I've been saying. Is it?
No, I think I'll come back next week. Just a clarification from something we spoke about before, which was the words intelligent design came up. And it's very important just to be aware of the difference between what we were speaking about in class as the kind of thing that holds everything together and these scientists searching for that. And another very specific thing which has been called intelligent design theory, which is, if you go home and Google it, you'll see there's been a lot of controversy about this, especially in the United States, because it's kind of a renewed form of what we call creationism. So we won't go into that in depth now, but it's just important to distinguish those two things, what we're talking about, what people like Polkinghorne are looking into, and the so-called intelligent design theory. So I'll just add that too. You might like to, as we go through the course, and especially towards weeks 11 and 12, we'll start looking more and more at how theology today is talking to the sciences. And one of the things we'll be looking at is how there's been a lot of controversy about that relationship between theology and science, and how there's a lot of good work being done there, but there's also a lot of the kind of conflict that Terry's been talking about happening as well, where people seem to want to stay inside their boxes and not talk, which is always a shame. Look, I'm going to only be very brief. I might actually get